to talk a little bit about Julia. So Julia and I have been in touch for a few months, and I will tell you about her work, but there's a lot more to unpack, as we were just discussing. So currently, she's a research fellow at LSE Cities. She's a coordinator for numerous research strands at LSE Cities, and she is working with the Greater London Authority, which is the Mayor's Office, as well as on urban governance in India. I know she's a teacher at the city's master's program at the LSE. She also teaches at Central St. Martin's, like myself. And she's taught in the past at the Architecture Association, which now I'm like stretching it by saying that we could be colleagues because I'm completely unqualified to do either of these things. But also she has exhibited at biennales around the world, at Somerset House, at Venice, and she's got this incredible interdisciplinary career. But really what has kind of come back again and again is a lens on making real change and activism. So Julia, welcome again. And I did want to start off by asking you about your job right now. What does it mean? Can you unpack for us a little bit about what you're doing at the LSE and your work on cities?
Yeah, so thanks for that intro. I think so. I'm a research fellow at the Centre, and the Centre, I think, has it's always had this idea that the sort of social produces the spatial and vice versa. And I think that's something in a way where I sit comfortably in this kind of school of thought, that, you know, I'm equally concerned with sort of social process as I am with sort of how the physical environment, our physical environment, is a vessel for where we fight, make love, cry, and all the sort of our human life, our everyday human life, and how it plays out. And so I think most of my work, I'm very interested in the sort of everyday banal interactions, but equally and increasingly so, I'm also interested in the city as a site for protest and revolution and for kind of contestation. And so that, you know, the Centre has this sort of wider remit. And I joined in 2015. I had actually just come back from India. I was doing my PhD there. And I came back to write my PhD, which was a pretty painful experience. And I joined the LSE to work with Suzanne Hall on a project looking at urban microeconomies on British high streets. And I think, like a lot of my career, I've just sort of flowed like a river with opportunity. And I ended up staying at cities. And cut to today, I've pulled back on my teaching. So I'm no longer teaching in any of those places you mentioned, which is a shame. But I'm just teaching, doing a few lectures at the LSE. And I was meant to be working on a project called Rubbish, Refuse and Recycling. I've actually said that name wrong, but I've had a memory blank because I'm nervous when I do interviews. But anyway, it's on the LSE website properly. And I was meant to be doing field work in Pakistan and Ethiopia on the lives and livelihoods of waste pickers. And obviously I cannot do field work because of COVID-19. And so I've had this year, and so that's the kind of research I do at the Centre. I do a lot of field work. I go into the ground and I do spatial analysis. So I use the skills I have as a trained architect, but I use them in research projects. And now in the past, I've translated that research into build projects. That's happening less so now. And this year has been quite interesting. And so to reflect on what I'm actually doing now is, in the absence, when I can't go out and go into the field and do what I think I'm good at, which is field work, I've had to find ways to work collaboratively with people and to, in a way, impart my kind of methods and processes onto other people who might not have my skills, who are then in effect doing the work that I would do. And so that's been really a really interesting process that's sort of ongoing. And in parallel to that, this summer, I set up an apprenticeship scheme at the LSE. And it links nicely with this work in Ethiopia, because the apprenticeship scheme, the idea is to work with young adults. It's a recognition of this sort of a deficit of getting voices, and in this case, young adults, but I think that extends to communities outside of a kind of dominant cultural register, and think about how to get them actively involved in the design and decision-making of projects. And in this context, we're talking about public space. So to cut short, we basically got some funding and we've set up the scheme. And so I have 5 young adults who've been paid to come to LSE to learn the methods and tools and techniques that I use, to then take those, and we've designed a series of public spaces which will hopefully get realized. So it's a kind of we're all working online. And in a way, for me, it's the sort of, I feel like it's where I think I needed to get to, of working with young adults, getting their tacit knowledge, empowering them with language, empowering them with skills, and then designing with them. So that's sort of a little bit of kind of I'm not very good at condensing what I'm doing, but yeah, that's my headspace right now.
A lot of headspace and a lot of things. So what I would say is, like, personally, that last thing you said really connected with me, because I'm working with younger adults right now, and I have found it to be really a shifting experience and something that's really affected how I see I don't know, everything from technology and design to impact and education in ways that I would not have expected. But I did want to just take a little bit of a step back through the lens of your work right now. I mean, you define yourself as an architect, and you said you previously translated your work as an architect, your training as an architect, into actual something that was built and physical and manifested. And now you've been doing a lot more of it through research. And then the third strand, I think I heard you kind of describe as, the physical / educational part of things, community. So is there any way that you could say how you would just define yourself and your practice, just to help us to understand, as kind of outsiders to this world, how you navigate as an academic and as a practitioner, and where they kind of come together?
I mean, I actually genuinely will struggle to answer that question. And I think a way that I can answer it is to say, I'm sorry, my dog is barking in the background.
Love that.
Working from home. I found that and I talk about this often, like when you decide to work for the majority condition, so how most people live in this world, when you make that decision and you say, that's what interests me, I think it's actually, so I have found that it's very, in a way, you can get money to deliver projects. I think it's you can see people doing that all around the world, but often the problem with those projects is that they're the right solution to the wrong brief, and it's because that person or that organization hasn't spent enough time with the community to understand the real needs. And that's where research comes in, and techniques of social science, to actually understand the problem. And so I always had this idea of my career of going, I'm going to use research funding and an academic position to get my brief right, and then use the kind of architect's hat to then deliver a project. That is a very difficult balance to get right. But that was definitely how I wanted my career to pan out. And in moments, I feel like I've gotten close to that. But it's not always been the case. And so I think for a long time, I've thought like how I operate is the long project of my life. How we work, how you operationalize yourself. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it really answers it. And for me, it feels, when you work, well, I don't know, maybe the state of the world right now is such, but in technology, in the kinds of work that I've done, we don't have that much time often to do the thinking and the research and the going deeper. And that's sometimes it comes afterwards. And I have found it to be difficult and challenging to think from an academic perspective in my own teaching right now, because that takes that grounding and time and sort of struggling. And I think Olivia used the word kind of walking through honey, and this sense of things take longer than you expect them to because they're meant to. And then, of course, manifest in surprising ways because of it. So that really resonates with me. And it also reminds me of the first time I met the team at Forensic Architecture, who, I know do very different work from you, but the similar grounding in academia. I remember I was in my offices, like very shiny and like free snacks. And one of them said, I think there was a couple of computer coders and a few architects. And one of them said to me, I just decided that after I wanted to show and prove that no matter what your degree is, you can use that to really make a difference in the world. And that really struck with me, because I think we sometimes discount if you didn't study social work or development. And, you said you made a decision to work with the majority of the world's population. That's a decision you make. It isn't actually a product of what somebody tells you that your job should be. And so for me, that's super inspiring. So can you talk a little bit about that then, as like when you decided to do this kind of work?
Yeah, so I think this is where, who I am is intrinsic to this. So I am half Venezuelan, I'm half English. My mom is from the Caribbean, my dad is from London. And I grew up in India. So I moved there when I was 10 years old. And so already from, for a very young age, I understood my inherent privilege. I understood wealth. I saw it like very clearly. The huge, how our, economic structures are so uneven. And I think a very important thing that happened when I was quite young was in Venezuela and Caracas, there was, I think it was 1999, Christmas 1999, in the run up to 2000, there was this huge mudslide. And so Caracas is in a valley, and you've got a quite tall mountain range and then the coast. And on the coastal side of this mountain range, you had mud traveling 3 meters high, traveling at 50 kilometers per hour, and entire slum communities were completely wiped out. And it really impacted me, this huge event that happened in Venezuela. And I went back the next summer. I was there. I was working with my aunt, who's an architect, and she introduced me to this radical woman who was there working on the ground, trying to deliver housing in this context. And I remember thinking, oh my God,
how
design.
Old were you?
I was 18 years old.
Okay. And
I remember thinking I had this beautiful, naive idea that design can be so transformative. And I think in a way, I lost that a little bit in my education. And when I graduated, there was very few architecture practices that I think were trying to seek out that ideal. And I'm sort of thinking of like Urban Think Tank, which was working in Caracas at the time. Those were sort of my heroes. And I thought, these are guys like working in slums, like trying to make change. And it was a really naive thing. And I went into mainstream practice, and I had this sort of what I like to call my early career, an early midlife crisis. And I found myself really falling out of love with architecture, because I was like,
where
this
were
is
you
not
in India?
In Delhi, in the outskirts of Delhi. And I was like, oh, I'm actually an international development practitioner. That's more what I'm like. And this was actually when I had this penny drop moment. And I was like, no, you need to work here through the lens of being an architect. And it's because as architects, as designers, let's extend that, we do have this ability to not only record and visualize and evidence what exists somewhere, like what is there, we also have the ability to vision what could be. And, that's a kind of a transformative project. That's a project where you can suggest transformative change. And then, sorry, I'm out of breath from moving my dog. And so I think that for me is where design becomes so powerful, and where you can distinguish yourself from a lawyer who might not be able to sort of see that sort of transformative ability. And so that was kind of like this really penny dropping moment for me, in the outskirts of Delhi. And also when I realized that they didn't need me to design their houses. They could do that. The residents did that better than any of me or my colleagues at the AAA could have done. But that's when I started getting into sewage, because that was what was needed. And at the time. And that kind of led to a decade's worth of working on sewage projects, which, I think has defined my career.
So, I mean, for me, like your TED, I watched your TED talk right after we had been introduced, and it felt, and just the use of language even, it just felt so disruptive for someone to use the word poo in a TED talk, first of all.
And I wasn't allowed to use the word shit, so I much prefer to say shit. It's a bit more visceral.
Yeah, I agree, actually. And but anyway, regardless, you've thought about it a lot more than I have. But so can you talk a little bit about your work with sewage and how I know that, it's been mostly focused on India, but, why it was that you chose to do it for 10 years, as you say, and how you got so deeply embedded in it, and how that's kind of continuing to your work right now, working with other cities.
So the origins was actually a really naive provocation. I was doing field work. I was interested in the accelerators and barriers of housing. And it was this sort of realization that housing was growing when toilets were getting connected in, and for various sociocultural reasons. And that the opportunities to deal with that on an individual basis were quite costly. And the provocation I had was going, okay, is there a way that as an architect, rather than being this sort of lone master genius designer, actually the role isn't to have a vision that I superimpose. The role is actually to say, guys, and to hold hands between people and say, if we all work together, there are solutions for your collective problem that when you collectivize them can become really cheap. And actually, cut through, that was a sort of a 3-year-long process. And at the end of my PhD, working very closely with a very small local NGO that was, an excellent NGO called Cure, we delivered on this project. And
what was the project?
So it was super simple. It was basically a really big septic tank. And that took it's technology that's readily available. I found this out later, but like my great-grandfather on the Lake of Maracaibo in Venezuela built the first septic tank a way to, my aunt told me this and I was like, my mind was blown.
Epigenetics.
And because, toilets before were sort of just flowing into the lake. And he was like, no, we can't do this. We need to separate our waste beforehand. And a septic tank works very simply. You hold your effluent with water, and you have a layer of scum at the top and a sludge at the bottom, and the water in the middle is cleaner. And if you repeat that process over and over again, your water gets cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. So it's a sedimentation process, and that's effectively what a septic tank does. And you can have one chamber that does it partially, or multiple chambers, and so on. And so we built a sort of multiple chamber septic tank that takes the waste from up to 320 households. And then it flowed into an upflow filter. So it's basically gravel. So that dirty water goes into gravel where bacteria cleans it. And the end product is something that can get safely discharged into a nulla, like you have them in Pakistan, open waterways, or used for construction. You can't drink it, but it also doesn't smell, and it also is okay. It's got some pathogens, but it's not sewage water. And so that was the really, really cheap system that got put in place. And although my great-grandfather was building this in Venezuela, I think, and India has its own particular problem around dealing with waste, which I think separates it globally. I think most open defecators in the world are in India, partially because it's huge population, but there are also other things at play which we can't go into in this talk because we don't have enough time. But and what frustrates me is that we have the designs and tools already at the right price point. It's like there isn't just a political willingness and a culture to deliver them on the ground. And so this project, because we delivered it, actually became a bit of a benchmark project. And I got a lot of exposure and learned a lot. And so I went on to then kind of consult on various other projects. I was never as involved as I was in that project. And then I started shifting into research. So, for example, a slum in the inner city of Delhi, so very different to the condition of this previous project that I was talking about. The community sort of liaised with the state and put a drain through it. And around 2017, 2018, I started then to do research to understand when you have access to a drain, when you can connect, why are you not? What's happening? And it's not just a money problem, it's actually a design problem. There's often, these houses are too small, the houses aren't structurally sound. And so then that led to a project that actually never materialized. And this, we're closing loops here. It never materialized because it was a sort of like a 1.5 year long process of talking to this community. And the idea that I had so inner city slum, we're completely very dense. And the idea that I had was to say, actually, let's have a kind of a supplementary provision to a community toilet complex. And so I designed this sort of really lightweight, toilet that could kind of fit in the crevice of a sort of shared courtyard. And endless community consultation about how this thing would be managed, who could use it, what would be the cost of maintenance, and so on. And then out of, you spend a year and a half talking, and all of a sudden you've got elections, and all of a sudden the slum's going to get demolished. And we didn't see that coming. And so I think something that has really dawned on me kind of just before COVID was that slow politics of patience that I really relied on from my kind of practice was fine in the 90s, was fine in the 80s. But today, urban processes are so fast and quite aggressive that actually that's out of sync with the kind of slow processes of the kind of activist architect. And now I think we have to be, and this is where I wanted to get back to forensic. I think they were quite slow, but if you see now, they are very fast. And it's because I think they're getting to realize that actually, if you want to make change, you've got to be more reactive. You've got to work faster. And this is going against a lot of the kind of, Nabil Hamdi and the big architectural players of this sort of type of work were very slow. Mm-hmm. And that was a good thing, that the pace allowed for you to take people along with you. And so now I think, and I don't have the answer to this, it's just a kind of a reflection that I was like, I'm not working aggressively enough.
Can we talk a little bit about what you were saying then, the course of this summer? How did this summer redefine the world from your perspective and through your lens as a designer?
Well, the first challenge was all of a sudden, I firmly believe that small change can have a ripple effect. So I do think that small things can be effective so that they can shape politics and culture. And I do think that small change can be effective so that it can be transformative and change processes. So like a sanitation project, I do believe that. But COVID kind of tested this, because my idea of small change is an embedded practice where you go in and spend a lot of time in a community and, and try and change things, try to empower. And all of a sudden it's like, well, you can't go anywhere. So all of a sudden I felt that mode of working was compromised. And I still think that. I still think we have a huge battle now to operate and to actualize small change with a view to making sort of those larger ripple effects. And I think anyone, I think so many people and so many, I'm sure so many of your colleagues and people who we meet and touch up against are trying to eke out those tiny ways that they can make a difference. And that was where I had this kind of idea of this apprenticeship scheme of going, well, actually, if I can do one thing right now, is I can work with a group of young adults and give them the language and potentially tools for them to be more active citizens. Because I think I sort of have this sort of brewing concern that we need to be more imaginative with the kind of citizenship we aspire to. And what I even mean by that is, like, right now, I think it's actually an act of defiance just to be positive. But, because there's so much muck out there. And in order to cut through that, I just think working with young adults is the best way to do that. To just share as much knowledge as I have. And that's literally what I did with this apprenticeship scheme, was I did lectures and just put them up online. And I worked with people who I think are amazing and who did the same. And we just gave them, basically the curriculum that we gave them was blog posts, podcasts, lectures that we did, reading that we love. And then we would just meet online and brainstorm. And I was like, this is the only thing I can do right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, disseminating, right? When you can't travel and you can't go, how do you give your power to others, in a sense?
It's knowledge, and just give it out, but then I was like, but I have to pay the people for this. It can't be kind of, if you want to push that. So that was why the paid aspect of it was so important. Like, it's labor.
Yeah, for sure.
It's not a gift that, oh, you're so lucky that I'm imparting my knowledge, that's good enough. No, you have to find ways to recognize the labor inherent in that.
Well, so actually to that point, you mentioned earlier the idea of the genius architect. And I don't know if you want me to quote you or not, but the white male neoliberal who comes in and sort of drops in a solution and a smart city and a tech-driven community or neighborhood. And I'm really curious about, first your perspective on that and how you think that's going to be impacted in this world that we're going into. On the one hand, everything's going online, so there's more space than ever for really expensive technology-driven Starchitect projects. But on the other hand, is that going to work anymore in this time of friction and I don't know, disruption and destruction in many ways of how we connect and how we live?
I mean, off the cuff, and I'm no expert in this field, but I do, my observation and, thinking about Venezuela and thinking about India is that COVID has evidenced, it's basically entrenched inequalities that were already there and made them worse. So bad situations are worse. The lack of sanitation and the impact of that is significantly worse. But what it's also done, and I think this ricochets around the world, is that it's exposed and valorized those people who were extraordinarily marginalized. And we can talk about that. And there's a huge, a gaze, sort of shift in the gaze of sort of people interested in urbanism to sort of valorizing care and valorizing maintenance. And COVID has enabled us to really celebrate this, sort of the importance of kind of our waste collection, the importance of these jobs that just had no value. And I think that's also highlighted, need for more feminized, the recognition of feminized labor practices. So like our transport systems are, they are made for a kind of job that is largely inhabited by white men, so all of a sudden, if you kind of go, actually, we want to have a compassionate city, we want to have a city that recognizes care and that recognizes maintenance, well, we need to have transport systems that are radial. It's kind of, and so I think for me, these are the kind of conversations in thinking of being an optimist that I'm kind of latching onto, that I think we need to make care more visible. So in celebrating it, we need to make it more visible, make it sites for opportunities for design, for reinvention, for transformation, and so on.
But so you said, so this is like where we come to again, like where you're at right now. So you're done with India, you're in London now, and you're thinking about cities, and you just use this word, compassionate cities and cities with care. What does this mean? How are we going to define the future of cities where most of the world's population is going to live? And what is the vision that we should be starting to build in?
I mean, and it is, I sort of have this, we live in a world where the house always wins. And it's an incredibly depressing time. You put on the news, most countries are run by absolute crooks. Beirut was so devastating because I think for a long time, our criminal justice system and our ideals as a society sort of felt that blue collar crime, the corruption doesn't kill. It's just it's just it's something that happens, but it doesn't kill people like drugs. But all of a sudden it's no, cronyism and this nonsense does kill. These backhand deals kill people and ruin cities. And I think that, the lack of, and this post-truth, everything going on with Trump, we do live in a post-truth world. And that worries me. And it worries me because there is no collective vision for society. We just don't have that. And if there's one thing that we need with COVID is collective action, because, if we have to work together, and that worries me hugely. And so I guess I do want to put my energies towards positively thinking about ideas that we can convene around. How can you convene people positively and optimistically around something? And it feels impossible right now, 100%. Does that mean we should not have that ambition and ideal? No. But I think it's also important to recognize that feels impossible right now. But I also feel that those of us who are in privileged positions, I haven't lost my job, I have remained employed, I can't be angry because I'm privileged. Does that make sense? Like I have to.
Yeah.
I can't just sit on my backside and go, fuck the system, fuck this, it's fucked. Because then that's defeat. So you have to find ways to move forward. I mean, I don't know. This is all kind of.
But like what I was going to actually say is that I think as a designer, as a designer, you are an optimist, but sort of by the definition of what your profession suggests. You create and you look to the future and your vision. And I understand sort of, I think a lot about technology in this way is technology is inherently positive. It's optimistic, it's generative. And I do think that there is a door kind of opening for someone like you. And it probably feels exhausting because you probably feel like you've been doing this, it probably felt like the most desperate place in the world to be working with a septic tank in, a town in India. And now suddenly the world feels like it's blown open one more time. And it really resonates with me what you're saying, but equally you're moving forward and that's really powerful. But I do want to ask about technology and I want to push you a little bit on that because you've talked a lot about community and spending time and, being physically present. And I know you've talked in the past about these kind of pointless smart cities, but then what is the role of technology in your work? I know that it's there and how do you see that helping you to scale impact? Or on the flip side, is it arrogant to think that we should be scaling solutions across Lagos and London and Toronto and all the places that we know that people are coming up with interventions that, maybe are completely conceited?
In the context, so in the UK went through these sort of steps and steps and steps. And I, of course, recognize, and so many of this, you see the parallels. So covering over the Fleet Street, that's in effect what I can see Delhi doing today, covering over nullas, which actually creates the problem worse because then you get methane buildup.
The same problem in Karachi.
Yeah, you have this, And actually it caused huge floods right now over the summer. And so obviously technology can allow processes that have been done in other countries to be leapfrogged. But I think that's an ideal. And I think, unfortunately, it is this sort of a quite a Western-centric concept and actually shows a lack of ideas and creativity that we have to roll out London's sewage system throughout the world when it obviously isn't. It isn't the benchmark. It's obviously not. Like Delhi should not be looking at London for its ideas. And so I think that's kind of, I guess, what I kept on banging on about in those days when I was in Delhi, actually, this isn't the ideal. And there is a lot of academic thought around this as sort of the networked ideal of, London and so on. It's just not, it doesn't fit. And so I think technology can discolor a lens.
Mm-hmm. I understand that. Well, that's both technology, that's also culture and context, right? Which is something that technology has, on the one hand, we're all now using the same devices or some version of them, and meant to be able to connect in ways that translate and speaking language that is meant to sound, equally, sort of resonant across culture and across industry. And yet it's really easy to forget people's circumstances. And I think to your point, we're at this moment in time where it's not just this vastness of the divide between Delhi and London, it's between rich and poor, between people who are furloughed and unemployed and those who have jobs. And we're assuming, because we're all sitting behind a screen, that things are the same for everybody, and obviously not.
And that was the sort of the underpinning of my studio at Central St. Martin's, was that I really felt that kind of Southern questions, let's say, can easily be applied to like Redbridge or Brent, because you're just what you're effectively then thinking about is, as a designer, is procedures and mechanisms for designing outside of this a dominant cultural register, and that requires new formulations, new thinking, new conceptualizations, and new languages for it to be relevant. And so in that sense, there have been procedural things that I can take from Delhi and that apply to London, because marginalization and the processes by which people are marginalized are actually shockingly similar. I mean, obviously, it looks very different. In India, it's well, in Delhi, you're talking about women who have to wake up at 4 a.m. to take a shit. And in London, you're talking about women who hold 5 jobs and and are not even getting paid a minimum wage. So, but they have a toilet in their house. So obviously there's differences, but I think how you operate as a designer is actually quite similar. I don't know if you've...
Well, it just makes me think about this idea of what those who are seen and those who are not seen. And this feels to me like a time where it's really this obviousness of who is hidden away behind wherever closed doors and who gets to be seen.
But that's what COVID did that. Like COVID, all of a sudden, and it did that in India when all of a sudden all these migrant workers were going back home. And all of a sudden it was such a shocking visual. You're like, oh my God, that is so many people, who've come to it. And it would have been the same in Karachi, like all these migrant workers who we knew about, and any city dweller, and even if you're kind of quite an inconsiderate city dweller, you knew that your city was serviced by huge numbers of largely men who would leave their families for prolonged periods of time to work on nothing, to kind of get these cities going, get these massive kind of beasts moving. And in London, it was the same. We could turn on our screens and it was like, who are all these people on the tube? It's the people who can't afford to stay at home. That's who's on the tube. They're not people who want to get COVID. They're people who have jobs that they can't afford to do what I'm doing right now. And I think that is actually quite useful for society to have a moment to go, oh, fuck, that's what underpins this existence, like the DPD driver who's like bringing us all of our, our lattes and whatever.
Yeah. I mean, to your point then, as an architect and as a designer, when we think of architecture and design, we think of the shiny thing on the surface of it. And yet you're thinking about all of the pieces that fit together underneath. And that's such a beautiful
image. Get to, the thing that I always bang on about, like designing processes rather than products. And that's, for me, that's the sort of, I guess that's what I like to do.
So I do want to close off by asking you about what the project in Ethiopia and Pakistan was, if you can share a little bit.
Yes, I mean it's currently ongoing. I mean it's a pure research project, and so we've got partners. We're working with NED in Karachi, and then our Ethiopia team isn't as embedded as the Pakistan team because we're the research. I think there's more focus on the Pakistan side, and it's working quite closely. So my colleague Jo Beale, who's an amazing woman who's done so much work, she did her PhD on waste pickers in Pakistan 30 years ago. And so when we pitched for the work, the idea was to go back to her sites. And Pakistan, for anyone who's listening who's really into sewage, they will know that, you've got the Orangi pilot project, which was a major benchmark project and still is today. I mean, it had, unfortunately, also intersects with sort of violence and problems in the city. So it's not entirely a happy story, but it's an amazing place to think about sanitation, to think about sewage, to think about waste pickers, to think about waste in general. And the research project was meant to go back and do this comparative study 30 years after. And largely we're doing it, but I'm not going. And so I was just speaking to my colleagues in Pakistan today about like doing drawings online so that we can draw collaboratively. And so it's pushing us on the UK side to think about methodologies that can cut through this challenge. So how you can be a productive team member doing ethnography when you're not there. And that's my huge anxiety around this work is how can I not be the annoying person in London being like, oh, have you spoken to this person? Have you asked this question? Which is obviously the risk. And this nods to bigger problems of research funding, where it lands, that too much money potentially lands to research institutions in London. And so I don't know, it's opening a whole can of worms about the sort of ethics of knowledge and who gets to make knowledge,
Yeah, well, so I think, wow, there's so many questions I have going on from this. And one of the things I did want to highlight was how, the beginning of our conversation, I was like, where is your bio? And you know, as a designer, you've designed your own story and you're obviously still on your way. And for me, this idea, I've only lived in cities my whole life and increasingly feel this agitation. And it's probably just COVID of like, where there is a surface and then there's everything else and we're missing all of it. And the cities of our world are going to define our lives and our futures, but equally people suffering and anxieties and what you said is all contained in these microcosms across the planet. And it's incredible that as somebody who, I know you feel like you're sitting on the outside of it looking in right now. But I still think, despite what you said, and I may be wrong, but this is my sense, is that is your knowledge. That is your collective knowledge and empathy and humanity and compassion and design thinking that even though you're not on the ground with this particular project is adding so much value. So maybe there is something to be shared across cities, and maybe that is something
I hope so.
Okay, so we do close with a question, and I know you still need to think about it, is around what is that radical dream you have for the future, the thing that you would love to manifest as a project of your own, or as something that you could work on, or as something that you've just kind of seen coming up over the last year and you've not been able to connect with. And you've expressed some of those really eloquently, but I wondered if there was one that really, design or not, is sitting with you right now.
I think this dream has got to be around sort of thinking seriously about participation and engagement and how citizens, people, every day cannot be the diminutive partner in that relationship. That's the sort of dream, because I think if we get there, I just think that will lead to, that will have such a transformative effect.
The power imbalance, rebalance is going to happen, right? There is some kind of
that's the dream, because that's inherent in the proposition, because if citizens are not diminutive, if they are equal stakeholders, if they are engaged with seriously, that means you acknowledge that person, you see them. That then alludes to economic structures that are more equitable. It implies that we redress colonial imbalances. It implies that we redress gender imbalances. For that dream to happen, all those other things inherently need to take place. And that's how you have effective and effective change.
Oh, that's amazing, Julia. I hope that many more people and all of us hear a lot more from you in the future.
You're being too kind.
No, your energy, but also you're a voice that needs to be heard. And so I'm really grateful to have had this time with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun chatting.